All these things are experiential. They're all different mysteries, is how we would frame it in witchcraft. And mysteries is like how I was talking about, like with dreams, this sort of like there's this je ne sais quoi quality to certain dreams that are prophetic or are a spirit visitation. And while I can't properly explain what that quality is, if you've had an experience with it, we can kind of talk about it and kind of understand what it is. And you're both kind of on the same page because you've experienced the same mystery, the same experience. These things are essentially techniques trying to push you in the direction of figuring it out for yourself and what works for you.
Welcome to the Repatterning Podcast, where we believe your mind-body system is your domain and that choosing the beliefs, habits, and patterns that best support you is your birthright. I'm your host, Auryn Lee, creator of the Repatterning Project, an 8-week course in learning to free yourself from the patterns of your past and program your mind for your dreams of the future. Join me for these extraordinary conversations as we unpack the keys to creating our reality. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Repatterning Podcast. I'm so excited to dive in to today's conversation with today's guest. But before I do that, I just want to let everyone know, since you've been listening to this podcast for a little while now, presumably, and you may have heard about the 8-week course, the Repatterning Project, that inspires these conversations. I wanted to let you know that we are now enrolling for a start on September 13th. So we start on September 13th, we go for 8 weeks, and we cover all of the ways that we can understand our mind, body, human operating system, the way that we learn our patterns, how we take on our beliefs and mindsets, and how we can adapt and change them using our will in order to become our favorite versions of ourselves. So if you've enjoyed some of the things that we've been talking about in these conversations, if you feel like you want to be a deeper part of the community, those doors are open. You can reach out to me. You can find us at therepatterningproject.com or on any of my social media. Reach out, say hi, we'll have a conversation, and we'll see if it's right for you. All right, and now I'm so excited to introduce today's guest. Today, we are going to be speaking with Matt Auryn, who is the author of The Psychic Witch, as well as The Psychic Art of Tarot and Mastering Magic. He is also the co-host of a podcast called The Circle is Podcast. Get it? It's a joke. With Rachel True, who you may also know as having been one of the stars of the movie The Craft. And he teaches at a whole lot of different, I was asking him just before this, should I mention, some of the places you teach? And he's like, oh, there's so many. His books have been translated into over 13 languages. His work is everywhere around the occult community. And he's someone that I have learned a great deal from. I'm proud to call him a friend. Welcome to the Repatterning Podcast, Matt Auryn.
Hi, I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me on today.
I'm so excited to have you here. I have your work in psychic development. I have to tell you, when this book, Psychic Witch, came through the mail and I opened it, I immediately was like, wow, first of all, it's so beautifully laid out. And the illustrations also are really, really gorgeous. And it's such a clear format made with all of these really clearly delineated exercises for psychic development. And what I'm interested in chatting about today is thinking of psychic development as one more way that we can repattern, that we can train our minds to do things that we previously didn't think that we can do. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about how psychic development is something that people can train in themselves.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm a big proponent that everyone is psychic. They may not be actively psychic all the time, but I do believe it's a natural human ability. And most of us have that kind of dormant in us. And I think it's kind of programmed out of us as a society. But I do believe from my own personal experience and from training other people that it is something that can be developed and can be awoken.
And share with us, what are some indicators that people might possess a psychic ability that is sort of like an inborn natural talent? What are things that people who are maybe otherwise unawakened to occultism might, but maybe they're listening to this, right? What are some indicators that they might have even more? Yes, everyone can train, but what are some signs that they might have more of a natural talent?
I think it's going to vary for everyone. I think everyone's wired a little bit differently. So, certain clair senses are going to be stronger than others. But I think like even the most average person has had those psychic experiences where like you're thinking of someone you haven't talked to in a really long time and then they call you, or you're thinking about a topic and then suddenly you see it everywhere, even if you've never spoken about it, and then I differentiate psychic ability and intuition. And I think people are a little bit more tuned into intuition naturally than psychic ability. But I think we mostly see psychic ability predominant in children, particularly up to about the age 7. You have children that have imaginary friends or that have like monsters under their beds, or like, have experiences where like, oh, they're talking to grandma that they've never met and like bring out all these details. I think that, like, as a society, like I said, it's kind of programmed out of us. One of the things I talk about in Psychic Witch is that I found totally independently, but I was like, oh, these are connected. In sociology, around 7 is when the child like realizes that people have opinions of them and how they conduct themselves and act and what they say forms how people think about them. So I think that's when we kind of start self-policing and we start kind of repatterning in a not a good way, to fit in a little bit more and be more accepted among other people, whether that's adults or older kids or even peers.
Yeah, we become conditioned through our experiences to shut down a lot of our natural intuitive gifts if they're deemed in any way like unacceptable or if we feel like they're going to get us bullied or things like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think part of it too is parents unintentionally trying to calm their children down and not scare them. Like, when the kid starts talking about things in their room or, like having imaginary friends, it's very natural for parents to be like, oh, that's just your imagination or it's not real. And, while it's done with good intentions, I think sometimes that, you listen to your parents. So you start turning something off within you.
I just thought of something. When I was a kid at summer camp, and I must have been like maybe 7 or 8 years old, I have no idea how I got this notion into my head, but I somehow began to believe that had the ability to tell people what animal they had been in their past life. And it got to a point where like this got around the camp and everyone started like and in my mind and granted this was a memory from a long time ago, but in my mind I just remember like hundreds of people and me kind of like just deciding what and I actually got really embarrassed about that like later on in my life, like in my 20s, like what was I thinking or whatever. And now I look back at that and I'm like, I wonder because it turns out like I do have certain gifts for being able to see certain patterns in people and like, detecting witch blood, which is not something I've been formally trained in. Something I want to get trained in because I feel like I have a natural aptitude for seeing that. And now I'm like, I wonder if I was right.
And I love, like in the book, I quote Lady Circe, who is a traditional witchcraft elder. She has a saying that if you would learn the witch's way, observe with care the child at play. And like, I think, with both psychic ability and magic, just like observing children is one of the most enlightening to like understand the sort of frame of mind to be in, like to both be receptive and, cast magic. In the psychic art of tarot, I even have an exercise where it's like, find a small child in your life that knows nothing about tarot and, have them pull a tarot card for you and have them tell you what they see in the card,
Mm,
to gain like their psychic impression because they have no idea what it means.
I love that.
Yeah, I was a weird kid. I'm sure you were a weird
Me too.
kid. I think most of us who are drawn to this stuff were weird children, and a lot of it has parallels with a lot of the things that we later ended up like, either devoting our lives to or became a big part of our spiritual identity. Like I
Yeah,
know that for me, like I used to try to form little covens when I was in elementary school even,
that's
I was one of
adorable.
those kids that made potions and I've always been kind of drawn to it a little bit more than even my peers. And I think that would be another indication of like psychic ability, like you were asking, like is just that kind of natural draw to these things, I think is an indication in itself, whether you have training or knowledge in it or not.
Yeah.
And then there's people like my father and my mother, but specifically my father, who is probably the most psychic person I've ever met in my whole life. But he doesn't own it. He doesn't claim it. He's almost afraid of it. And it's like this weird denial he has with it because he's like a born again Christian or whatever.
Mm.
He'll say things and then it'll happen that day, like exactly, as he
Wow.
just, is kind of spitballing it. And I think that's like another kind of sign of like a quote unquote natural like psychic or someone with inclined psychic abilities is that they just kind of know things or recognize patterns, like you were saying, that develop. I think like people with very vivid dreams also tend to have a more of an inclination to psychic ability and quicker development because they have such a rich inner world. And that's such a major part of all of this. I really strive, as you know, to bring people back to imagination and re embracing the power of imagination. And I think that, like, that can lead to spiritual psychosis as well. But I think like it's important to understand that like all imagination is not necessarily like just flights of fancy or delusion. And not all delusion is connected to psychic ability.
Yeah, that's a great topic, by the way. How do you figure out or discern the line between delusion that can potentially, lead one down the path to a spiritual crisis or, just like having a whole false narrative versus what is the information we can trust?
Yeah, so this is kind of hard. Once again, so like all of these things, none of them are like one size fits all for everyone because everyone is wired differently and a lot of things come to people differently. And my answer people usually don't like, which is meditation and journaling or something like that. Something where
Mm,
you're record keeping and you're learning how your mind works. The example I usually give is, have you ever had a dream where like a past loved one comes to you or a dream that's prophetic and like there's a different quality to those dreams? They feel different and you can't
yeah,
really explain it. Like we don't really have the language for it, but if you've experienced it, you know there's a different quality to it. And if someone else has had it just like this, like they can have a frame of reference of what you're talking about, because they have their own personal experience. So I think with psychic ability, it's a lot like that. It's a lot of like finding how information comes to you and also record keeping, like, well, how accurate was it in the long run? And you can start to see patterns of like, oh, like when it's accurate, there's this feeling or there's this quality to the information versus this, which usually isn't. Another thing that I always tell people to look out for is anything that is a projection based, if it's about someone else, as well as things that are self glorifying in ways that maybe like are more egotistical. And I think that comes more to like spirit communication more than anything. I have spirits that like are constantly are like, no, you're wrong, like like you're just straight up wrong about this. And I think that's, a good reality check as well as just having people in your life, whether they're in person or not, but people that you trust, even if it's an online community, that can kind of rope you back in when it seems like you're going a little bit overboard or in a direction that's a little bit unhealthy. Because I think, like, for example, like, not necessarily about this topic, but my husband is usually a good, like, he can see things in me before I can see them myself,
mm.
whether it's certain patterns or qualities or behaviors. So I think, like, having other people in your life as a good sounding board can also help with spiritual psychosis and reeling you in back to reality.
Yeah, yeah, that's so true. And I love what you said also about really knowing ourselves and our own patterns. Something we were just speaking about, like the idea of, warding off psychic attack. And something that I had experienced when I had an attack happen to me in recent months was I noticed that there were certain thoughts and impulses in me where I was like, this is not like me. Like there was one where, and I've said it on this podcast a number of times. I always encourage people to question me or to, don't just take what I say as an authority. Like always, like if there's something that you're curious about, always ask, always question, always feel free to, tell me to get lost or whatever, like I'm not the only teacher out there or whatever. And I felt myself feeling like that, like, don't question me, like, how dare you question my
Mm.
experiences or whatever. And thank goodness I caught myself, because but it's so scary thinking about how there is a potential for that delusion to set in and how deeply, because I've been doing this work of repatterning now for like about a decade, and like it's scary, like if I had not done that work, if I did not know myself as well as I do, like I don't want to even think about what would happen, because sometimes like it can feel real, right?
Yeah. And that's, the Oracle of Delphi, like they said above it was know thyself. And I mentioned that, I think, briefly in Psychic Witch. But that's, people have asked, like, Matt, when are you going to teach about spirits? When are you going to teach about like spirit work and deity and stuff? Like, I keep it like open because it's a beginner. But like, my emphasis, particularly with Psychic Witch, is to get to know your own spirit before you start even interacting with any other spirits. Because I think that, like, spirits will also use things against you if they're not a good spirit, or
Yeah.
they want to somehow manipulate you. Because I mean, spirits are like people, right? Like, there's all kinds of people with all kinds of different motives. And that's why, a lot of you see in a lot of online discourse, it's a popular thing to say that, like, oh, psychology or self-help or self-development or self-work or spirituality has nothing to do with magic. And I agree on some level. You don't need any of that for magic. But I think that, like, as a magician, as a magical practitioner, even a psychic, being clear on who you are, understanding yourself, understanding where your weaknesses lie, where your vulnerabilities are, where your strengths are going to serve you immensely. Like, when it comes to magic or psychic ability, as well as just your personal life. And I think that's like one of the things that, like, I'm sorry, I'm nerding out and going on a tangent, but
Oh no, please
Aleister
nerd out.
Aleister Crowley, when he did the foreword to the Mather's translation of the Ars Goetia, he has this quote that he's criticized about a lot, which is that the demons of the Goetia are just parts of your mind, right? And I think there's a truth in that. I mean, aside from like the hermetic, like as above, so below, as within, so without, I think it's more about like there's something in you that resonates with all of those demons, And so, like, learning, whether you go through the HGA, whether you take that as literal or metaphorical, but this idea of like binding your demons, like having it to where your inner demons are all under control, then external demons can't use their powers of influence against you in that area, in that realm.
Yes, yeah, because they're literally like the neural pathways that you use the most often are the ones that are most vulnerable. So it's like, it's so much easier to, like, if you cast on someone that they're gonna have like a crazy bender of a weekend and destroy their life or whatever, like it's easier to do that to someone who has a propensity for, addiction than someone who's like some vegan new age teetotaler or whatever. Like because the pathway is there.
Well, and then even then, like, that's why, it's so trendy and it's so overused and overabused. But like the idea of like Jungian shadow work, I mean, because it's so overhyped and it's also turned into things that it never was meant to be. But this
Yeah,
idea of like the shadow being things that like we don't recognize, So a lot of people are like, oh, weren't you conscious of your shadow? Like, no, like, because it's my shadow. But,
exactly.
the right? It's literally your blinders. But, like, the constantly doing self-inquiry, constantly evaluating yourself and striving to be a better person, and being willing to work on your own personal flaws is going to serve you in these ways. Because, a lot of times in my experience, a lot of these, like, love and light new age people end up having the darkest shadows and the
Ton of
darkest
shadow.
demons, and, we're constantly seeing that unfold, I mean, all the way up to, like, Deepak Chopra,
Yeah.
and his whole thing. So I think there's definitely something about, while magic may not be inherently about self-development, I think that they go hand in hand in a path to not destroy yourself with magic, because I think magic and spirits exacerbate whatever is going on with you and your life. I mean, that was the whole point of the movie The Craft, right? Like, you
Right.
know,
Right. Yeah, and I'll
so
push even further back on that narrative because I really think that self-knowledge and knowing what patterns we have, those patterns and mindsets inform our desires. They inform what we believe is possible for us. And like, how can you say that, oh, that has nothing to do with magic when it's literally informing what magic you choose to cast?
yes,
This is a
yes,
huge thing that I'm talking about because if you are running patterns and you're trying to your patterns are essentially strategies for getting the
mm,
things that you want, right? For earning love and safety, for earning security, whatever, all the things that we are seeking as humans. And so often those are conditioned into us in ways that are misguided, so we people
yes.
please when we want to earn love or whatever instead of having love for ourselves. We take on and that's essentially kind of what repatterning is it's looking at these strategies we're using and taking those out and installing in their place the strategies that actually get us the things that we're looking for by making those conscious and choosing.
1,000%. Well, I'm not someone that's constantly, going on the internet and being like, "Oh, my magic's so big and bad," and like, "My magic always gets results." And, I am at a point where my magic almost always works. And
Yeah.
part of that is because I know what I'm casting for and I know that I want it. And, I'm a very big proponent that both psychic ability and magic, the biggest obstacle is yourself. And so I think a lot of times when people cast magic and they're not seeing results and they did everything correctly, it's like, well, your will's not there. And it's not just about your personal willpower. It's about having, and my work is very big on the self being multiple aspects, right? It's about having all of yourself aligned to know that you want it. Because a lot of times on a conscious level, you think you want something, you think, "Oh, I absolutely want this." But there's parts of you that don't want it or don't, for example, love magic or money magic would be the best easiest examples to grab for,
Yeah.
where like you're like, yes, I want this, but then there's part of you that's like, I don't deserve this. And that's so common, and it sounds like that's like what you're talking about, like, at least partially of repatterning
Yeah.
those
Yeah, and
narratives.
it's also just that like if we don't really examine our strategies that we're using to get what we want, if we add
Yes.
magic to the mix with that, then we're just 10xing those strategies that are already going in the wrong direction. Like
Yeah.
I thank whatever spirits were looking out for me that I did not learn magic until I began like my really magic like was my real initiation into magic and my repatterning journey were kind of one and the same.
Mm,
And because I just learned that for whatever reason, going, oh, you should always start your intentions with the word I, right? So I, blah,
mm,
blah, blah. So I thank God because like what back in the day before, like I used to be a pickup artist. I can only,
mm.
I would have been like full on love witch. I'm sure, if, if, and I'm making the reference to the Anna Biller movie, of course, which I'm sure you know. But just for our listeners,
Mm.
I'm not saying like every love witch does this, but like according to the movie, she just she tries to. I related so hard to that movie. I was like, I felt so called out by it. My former self, but like, oh, trying all these things to earn love, and then like being disappointed that no one actually like shows up for her and cares for her. So yeah, we're just
Yeah.
amplifying strategies that already don't work if we're doing that. So I don't know how anyone says like, oh, self development and spirituality has nothing to do with magic. I tell people all the time like sigil magic, it will take you 2 minutes to learn and a lifetime to master because it's not about
Mhm.
making a sigil. It's about what are you casting for? And that's the part where it really comes in. You have to think about it.
I think, like, I definitely agree. And I think that applies for a whole bunch of magical and psychic things across the board. Like, one of the things that I really emphasize in Psychic Witch is this idea that, like, yes, some of these things seem basic. They seem like beginner things, but like you said, like it takes a lifetime. Like I'm still finding depths in things that I'm like, oh, I didn't know, like, it went this far, even just like grounding and centering. Like I'm constantly like coming across like, oh, I see how this can be used in other avenues. And I also think that, like, for example, grounding and centering, especially the way that I teach it, like I think it teaches you how to direct energy. And you don't even
Mm.
realize that that's what you're doing, but you're learning what magic feels like going through you and moving through you, you know? And I think that is helpful in tons of areas. But yeah, the starting things with the first thing that popped into my head when you said that was the movie Labyrinth, right? From the 80s. Like, because, you know, she has that scene where she like does her dramatic prose from the book with her baby and she's like, you know, Goblin King, you know, take this child away. But the goblins are like, what the hell? You know, like that didn't even start with the words I wish. Like, what is that
Yes.
rubbish? You know? Like
Do you know I literally used that scene in the first module of my 4-week course, Myths and Magic, to talk about how, like, you need to call on like, there are these beings who are they're just waiting for you to say the magic words and they to come out of the woodwork and help you, and they're, like, there and they're but they can't, you know, they can't do it without your permission, so you need to say so that's so cool that you brought that up because I'm like, that's like my almost very first beginner teachable moment when I teach folks magic.
I love that.
So tell me also, we talked about a little bit about like what might be the signs that someone has natural psychic gifts. I'm wondering what might be the signs that someone has natural magical gifts because in the book you do make some differentiation between psychism and magic and obviously there's lots of overlap. But how do you think, you know, or do you think that they differ from the indicators of psychic ability and how so?
I don't think they differ that much, honestly. My view, and I know like a lot of people disagree because it's very broad, but my base belief from working magic and psychic ability, like pretty much since I was a little kid, at least exploring it, is that a magical ability and psychic ability are the same thing. Like it's just is it in reverse or forward? You know, are you directing energy out to inform your environment or are you receiving energetic information from your environment? So it's input output, you know. And I think, you know, a lot of the qualities that you would see that indicate that you're psychically gifted would also indicate that you're magically gifted. The problem is that a lot of people end up getting stuck in one or the other, either you know output or input mode. And so like I write in the book, you know, like I've known many incredibly talented psychics that can give like the best life advice, really impressive information, but they can't manifest for crap. And likewise, I've seen magicians that can do like great feats of magic, but they're like completely blocked off from any sort of psychic ability or input or direction in their life. And I think that like they both serve each other. You know, like you need the guidance to help your direction with magic. And I think magic without that direction, I don't know if I'm wording that clearly, but I hopefully like that kind of makes sense. Like I think that like aside from being able to feel the energies and interact more directly with the spirits and the energy that you're working with in magic, I think that like things like divination and like looking into things of like, you know, I do a lot of divination before I do magic too, you know, of like, is this the best way to do it? You know, I'm not going to let a bunch of cards bully me around, but I am going to listen to their guidance of like, oh no, maybe I should move my plan this way and go with this strategy first. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. I think I'm one of those folks who magic started working for me almost right away when I started
Mm.
doing it, but I had to really open up more to the receiving information. And even to this day, you know, I rely a lot on divination, on cartomancy, and you know, my joke is like I can't hear without my pendulum. You know, and funny enough, like sometimes even just putting it in my hand and getting into that state allows the messages to come through, and then I'm just confirm. Oh, did you say this? Yes, no. You know,
Yeah.
at
Yeah,
that point.
and
But
I think,
yeah.
like, it really serves me to like, this is how it, like, serves me outside of magic. It serves me in training people in magic. Because, like, in person, like, when I'm teaching something fundamental, like a circle casting, like, one of the things that I'll do in person is I will cast a circle with the people that I'm teaching inside the circle to feel the change in the energy. And then I'll take it down, and then I'll cast a circle with them outside of the circle with me inside of it to feel the difference of energy. And then when they go to do it, aside from feeling those different things, like I've had this phenomenon that has come with like developing my clairaudience where like when a circle is cast properly, I'll start to hear that tinnitus ring until the circle is lifted. So I
Oh,
can
wow.
tell energetically like if they cast it or not. And that can help me to kind of like be like, okay, well, like let's let's work on this a little bit. So for my own magic, that's also helpful too, because I know when the energy is flowing. I know I think even with magic, you kind of naturally start developing psychic ability, at least a little bit. When you call in spirits, when you call in spirits and they come, you feel them.
Yeah.
Like there is a change in the atmosphere at the least, you know. And I think it's hard to not notice that. But it's one of those things of like, you know, that is a psychic perception of something related to magic. And I think psychic ability can help you be more precise and make sure that everything's going according to plan. And I think that, like, which was the point of my second book, Mastering Magic, you know, magic can be used to enhance your psychic ability, you know? So you can essentially create this kind of circuit of like, you know, development that just kind of helps you level up and level up and level up. But as long as you're doing that inner work and that self-development, I think that like that is incredibly important. And that's why like I love hearing like about the work you're doing. I think that's really cool and it's really needed. Whether it's even for
Oh, thank
magic
you.
or not, just you know, in people's lives in general. I think that's great.
Yeah, thank you for that. That means a lot. And I want it to be accessible to people who don't work magic because it doesn't have to be inherently magical, like understanding the way that our human mind body system operates. But man,
Yeah.
if we're gonna do magic, we better we,
Yeah.
re- we really better know it. But I'll go ahead and I'll put myself on record as saying I'm one of those people who has a hard time detecting that change in the atmosphere. And actually
Uh-huh.
like and I have called on spirits before and I've even begun to be able to visually perceive them in,
Mhm.
in a scrying device like a crystal ball or glass ball in my case. But I rely a lot on like the pendulum to be like, are you here? Is this you? Is your true name? And then, the cards for the messages and things like that. So, and I attribute that a lot to my trauma response overall was desensitization. My body just shut off after years of me essentially not paying attention to it, kind of yelling at me, being like, "We don't like all these things that are happening to us," and my being unable to protect me and my body from that. And so I would actually love to know even for myself, like what do you recommend for someone who is on that path and is learning magic and is communicating with spirits and has, some successful results, but still, sometimes feels a little like a fraud because it's like, are they here? I don't know.
Yeah, you know, so this goes into what I was saying about like how people are wired differently, you know, and it's not just even naturally wired, it's things like trauma. It's things like neurodivergence. You know, everyone's wired a little bit differently, you know, and neurodivergence is a whole spectrum. I'm a big proponent on, you know, because one of the things that I got a lot of feedback on with Psychic Witch was like, oh, I have aphantasia. And sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. And they just had to like keep working at it. You know, in the second book, I do have techniques for if you do have aphantasia or difficulty visualizing. But like, I'm like, you're getting hung up on the visualization part, right? You're getting hung up on that. Like, I'm teaching all of these clairs for you. You know, I'm very big on develop what you're weak at. Work on developing that. Know what your strengths are, but then try to work on your weaknesses. So I have the opposite as you. So like my trauma and my neurodivergence, like it makes me overly sensitive, right? So like I feel things atmospherically, like quickly and I feel things in other people quickly. That doesn't mean that. Okay, let me explain it a little bit different with a different kind of reference. So people tend to be surprised, for example, that like internal clairvoyance was the hardest thing for me to develop. Visualization was the hardest thing for me to develop. I had to put a lot of work into it, and it's still not my strength. It's still not my strongest of my clairs and of my senses. So I don't think there's like a right or a wrong way of like if you're not feeling the spirits in the room, I don't think that's necessarily like you're not psychic or you're not doing it correctly, you know. I think everyone has their strengths and their weaknesses. So for example, your pendulum. you're probably better at a pendulum than I am, because those are different psychic responses going on. So, like, I think that having divination, there's a reason divination developed so vastly and has been around for so long, is because it is that sort of like double checking on things. And I do think that it is a skill in itself, and it is a psychic skill. I think I wrote it in the Psychic Art of Tarot, how I believe that, like, working with tarot, for example, just in general, just working with it is going to make you more psychic. It is going to just open those pathways naturally, whether you intend to or not. And I think the same is true with a pendulum. I think the same is true with magic. I think when you consciously put effort into developing things, then you kind of have an advantage in those, though. So, and I'm not trying to say that like aphantasia is not real. It is absolutely real, and difficulty with it is real. But I think that A, putting effort into things that you're not good at, but B, also finding what works for you is very, very important. I don't know if I answered your question or if I just went on a total tangent.
No, I think that was a great answer, and I actually like that was really affirming for me to know that just because I'm not good at perceiving things in one way doesn't mean I'm not good at getting accurate information in the ways that I am good
Yeah.
at. Yeah, no, that was super helpful. I'd also like to chat about clairaudience too, because we've had a number of guests on the podcast who have dissociative identities or multiple selves within the body. And
Okay.
I'm curious for folks with that experience, how would you discern let me back it up a little bit. Let me talk about
Okay.
like voice hearing first off. So
Okay.
there are folks who have like natural voice hearing. How do you trust what information, I guess, is coming like internally versus externally?
Yeah. So this is one of the things that used to annoy me for a while and confuse me for a while when I was developing my psychic ability is there were a lot of teachers that of psychic ability that would write or teach that you will never hear external voices. If you ever hear external voices, then you need to go seek help. And that is absolutely not true. I have known so many other mediums and psychics too that it's like, yes, there's absolutely a phenomenon where you externally hear voices, as well as internal voices, which is how it tends to happen more. Um, my baseline for this of like kind of determining like, is this a psychic phenomenon or is this something that may be out of my range of expertise to handle or speak on properly is the nature of the voices, like what are they saying? So are they belittling? Are they angry? Are they stressful? Or on the other hand, are they over flattering? Are they over grandizing? I think either of those can be sort of a red flag, whether it is a psychic ability or not a psychic ability. I think either of those are kind of like a check of like, okay, well, something's may not be completely copacetic with the information that's coming through. I think that I have kind of a weird kind of notion of differences as well when it comes to spirits and people and things like that. Because I think we're all interconnected and we're all intertwined a lot more than we realize. I think the personality, the ego personality, is very big on like I am a separate identity. And I don't think that's always necessarily true on different levels of reality, which goes back to what I was saying about like demons and Crowley's take on it being like parts of your brain. I think that like yes, they are parts of our brain, but that doesn't mean that they're also external. So I'm not an expert in these fields to be able to say what is or isn't a clinical or a certain diagnosis. But I will say that like I think that it does get kind of blurry on like, do these things overlap? And what does that mean? I think it's more about like what is the spirit saying to you? The voice that you're hearing, what is it saying? How is it presented? Is this information something that can be verified, something that's helpful, something that may even be challenging because it tells you that you're wrong, which I've had many times and it's very humbling, but it ends up that, yes, a lot of times I am wrong about something. So I think it depends. I mean, I think it's very case specific. I'm also not an expert on like multiple personalities or anything like that.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you on it being blurry, and I actually, even based on some of the folks who are, both have lived experience of dissociative identities and are also clinicians. Like we had Katie Keach on last season, who's both of those things. And the diagnostic process of that in traditional therapeutics is just like it's messed the F up. So like I'm not necessarily asking about like, oh, how do you know you need a diagnosis? Because I take a much more sort of like holistic, and indigenous informed look at things like actually, multiple parts of souls. Like
Mhm,
that can exist in a person and it doesn't need to be pathologized necessarily. But I guess what I'm curious about is how if you experience clairaudience, maybe you
mhm.
even experience like an abundance of clairaudience because of that reason, whether it's just having a door open to spirits or whether it's having multiple selves, how might you harness that for mastery and be able to use that the information that's coming to you as a psychic gift? Like how do you train that ability? How would you go about that?
It depends on if your motive is spirit communication or whether it's receiving psychic information that presents itself as a voice. So this is
Ooh,
also
wait, that's a
one.
fascinating distinction. I hadn't even thought
Yeah,
of that.
so this is one of the things too, is that, like, I think, and this is gonna sound super judgmental, and it's not meant to be judgmental, it's just my personal observation and belief. I think there's a lot of talented mediums that are not mediums, they're psychics. And I
Mm,
think that, like, they're picking up on information about the person's life or the person themselves and what they know about their deceased person. I'm very big on evidential mediumship that proves that you have connected with someone that is past because the person sitting in front of you doesn't even have that information or it's like unknown
mm,
to anyone. But, there's ways to develop clairaudience that I talk about in the book, such as listening exercises. Like one of the ways that I developed it was just listening super closely. And that sounds really kind of lame. But I picked it up from, I think it was something stupid from my childhood, some stupid movie that was about karate. Because, like, when I was a kid, karate was the big craze in all the kids' movies. But it was something about, like, meditating and listening very, very closely and listening closer and listening closer. And so, like, I would do that as an exercise of, like, well, what all am I capable of hearing? And that I would start getting information that way. And I would start
wow.
being able to pick up on like when a spirit wants my attention. I am a proponent of, a lot of times also of having that kind of tinnitus sense that like tells me a spirit's trying to tap me on the shoulder. And it's
Mm.
a little bit different than tinnitus because I've had it, but it's a very specific pitch. And always when I'm like, okay, what do you want? It stops. Which is always my confirmation of like this isn't just something going on with my ears. This is a phenomenon beyond anything like that.
Wow,
Um,
that's a really helpful tip because I every once in a while get a ringing in my ear, but I've always attributed just to, I lived in New York for 10 years. I make music, sometimes very loudly
yeah.
or whatever. So,
Yeah, I mean, and tinnitus is a real thing, and it does happen kind of randomly. But like next time it happens, like just stop and be like, "What's up?" Like what do you want to tell me? And see if you may not even pick up on what the information is right away, but sometimes just acknowledging it, if it disappears right when you acknowledge it, for me, that's like, yes, a spirit's trying to contact me. If I'm not picking up clairaudiently on it, I get kind of dumb with my spirits too.
mm.
I am very big on like, okay, like here are the rules, here are the guidelines. This is how you need to communicate with me. It needs to be clear, or else I'm not going to get the information. And so you're wasting your time. I'm wasting my time. But if something is trying to communicate with you and you don't feel like you are necessarily getting the information from them, divination. That's when you go to divination. You're like, okay, well, like let's use a pendulum, let's use tarot, let's use runes to try to form a dialogue here.
And let's say like there's someone who's like the opposite of me. Like for me, I've had to open up my sensitivity more, but let's say that there are people out there who like have that overabundance of information coming in. And you just mentioned like one way is like to ask the spirits like to verbally dialogue and say, "Hey, you need to make this clearer," or whatever. But let's
Yeah,
say for people who may have grown up like again like afraid of their gifts, like you were talking about, especially like when there's influences of like school or organized religion or bullying or things like that, how would you recommend a person start training to be able to turn that kind of overabundance of
Mhm.
psychic flow that may have been perceived throughout most of their life as something that is threatening because it makes them different or whatever? How would you recommend that they fine tune that into something that they can use?
Yeah, yeah. So that's a great question. And it's not just clairaudience, right? Like it's a lot
It
of
could be
psychic
anything, right?
input can be overwhelming, including like, like I have external clairvoyance. That's one of my strengths, not internal, but external. Like I see shadows, I see lights, I see auras,
Wow.
and that can be overwhelming and it can be exhausting at times too when you're just trying to relax and chill. So, like, a big part of like what I went to explore and learn in my psychic training is how to turn that down. And one of the techniques that I teach in psychic witch, well, there's kind of two ways, right? So, like, let me get a little anecdotal with this. So, I worked in Salem for many, many years as a professional psychic and tarot reader, and Octobers are insane. They, unless you've experienced October in Salem, you do not understand what I mean by it being insane, but it is insane.
I
Like, it's
bet.
nonstop. Like, you can barely walk on the streets. You have tourists from all over. And as a reader, it's literally back to back all day, like day in, day out, day in, day out. And I found myself like not just fatigued and burned out and stuff like that, which I teach to remedy in Psychic Witch, but like I found that like I couldn't shut it off afterwards. Like I was just on all day and then I couldn't turn it off. And it's like
Wow.
I need to rest and I'm not on the clock. like business is done. So one of the things that I did to kind of train that is I used the Pavlovian response, right? So like I started conditioning myself just like I would to tap into psychic ability. Like I teach in Psychic Witch, so you don't have to go through all the things and you can just kind of slip into it. I did it for getting out of it too. So I would use a ring, a hematite ring, and I would program myself that like when I'd put it on, like I'd be like, I am not doing readings. I am not psychically open. The shop is closed. Every time I would start a reading, I would take the ring off and I would affirm to myself, I am open for business. I'm open for psychic ability. So that kind of gatekeeps a little bit of like an on and off switch. Another technique that I teach in the book is treating it like either a volume dial or like a faucet of information and using that empowered imagination, that visualization, whether it's seeing it or feeling it or knowing it or affirming it to yourself. Just this idea of like, okay, we need to like turn down the flow a little bit because sometimes it's also too loud, so you can't make out the information. You need it just a little bit less, a little bit clearer and a little bit more precise so it can be helpful in that matter. Sometimes you need to turn it up because you're like, I'm just not getting it. I'm not picking up on it. So I find those two specific techniques to be very, very helpful, particularly when it's like clairaudient things or clairvoyant things, or more intuitive things, which I link. A lot of people like refer to being an empath or the empath skills. I associate that more with the intuition side of things than the psychic side of things, because that's another thing that can be super intense. And I come across a lot of like people that identify as empaths and even people who teach it and write about it, where I'm like, okay, but you're not a good empath. Feeling things strongly does not mean you're a good empath. Like learning your boundaries and learning how to like turn it off and not internalize things is what makes you a good empath.
Actually, that's a great segue because I know we were also going to chat about folks who have neurodivergence and how ADHD can affect like even exercises like meditation. I know for me, I have struggled sometimes with sitting down and training. I find that I'm better at training magic when I'm actively working on a situation I care about, and like
Hmm.
putting that energy there will kind of train my gifts automatically. But yeah, I'm not
Right.
I'm not gonna lie, like, I have trouble even doing a daily, like, grounding and centering or things like that, and so I'm curious, like, what are your recommendations for yeah, for folks with that kind of neurodivergence?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it can be really tough. And before I jump into that, you mentioned something that, like in Mastering Magic, I drive home this idea of enthusiasm and sincerity, right? Those are going to be your keys for magic. And like both of those words have root etymologies that are like magical or theologically related that a lot of people don't realize. Like enthusiasm is to be ensouled by a god in theoism, right? Enthusiasm is like the root of it. So I think that like earnestly wanting to. I don't think that there's necessarily a right or wrong way when it comes to your practice, as long as you're trying. You have the enthusiasm, you have the drive to do it, which sometimes you don't always. And some teachers, like I know Jason Miller is very big on like just do it, whether you want to do it or not, just do it. For me, a lot of the feedback that I got, for example, was the very first exercise in Psychic Witch because of the way that I worded it, which is like learning the countdown and learning to count down from 100 to 0 3 times in a row before moving on. And that's the word I should have used, is before moving on. So people didn't continue reading and realizing like what I say later about it, which is that like with meditation, you treat it like a gym. You treat it like lifting weights, right? So your mind wandering, for example, is not necessarily doing it wrong. That is the meditation, recognizing that my mind has wandered and then pulling it back is what strengthens that focus, right? So cutting it into bite sizes. So like instead of doing 100 3 times, do 10 once, and see if you can do that. And then like as you get better at that, as your focus develops, building on that. For those of us who are got to get our wiggles out, can't necessarily sit still and close our minds and have that attention span. While meditative exercises, like I mentioned, are going to help strengthen that, it can also be really helpful for the more ADHD minded to have something like the spiritual technology that is in Catholicism and Buddhism and Hinduism, which is like beads, having something to physically touch and physically do and physically move through while you do it. And in the second book, I have that as one of the exercises to replace it. So you count down touching the beads, because then you give your monkey mind something to play with, something to touch. Another thing that can be helpful is learning that meditation is not just sitting down, it's not just stillness, it's not just clearing the mind and having focused. Like for me, the meditation that I'm the most focused on is getting into the alpha brainwave state, right? Which other people would say is the flow state. And for some people, that's going to be dancing. For some people, it's going to be art. For some people, it's going to be like my husband. He crochets and he knits, and that's his meditation because it locks him into something that gets him into that flow state. So I think it's okay to understand that everyone is different and different things are going to work for different people. So explore, put effort into things, try things, and then also realize when this isn't for me, I need to find something else. I need to find something different that is going to work for me. Because your practice in the end is your practice. And the most important thing is not doing it right, it's having it work for you. So, I mean, like, as long as you can get yourself into that state. One of the things that like my husband talks about a lot, and I talk about, is that like as people who are kind of naturally psychic and are naturally kind of tuned in, as well as like both pretty not neurodivergent, a lot of these things we just know how to do. Like I know how to disassociate and get into that alpha state. So a lot of our
Yes.
struggle as teachers is learning how to present this to neurotypical people or even neurodivergent people to kind of figure out, oh, this is what we're doing in steps that it's like, oh, I can get to this place. How do I teach someone something that I can just do naturally? And so that's been our big challenge over the years as teachers and as writers. Because for me, that's the alpha state is disassociating. It's
Yes.
it's a focused disassociation.
That was a huge breakthrough moment for me actually in in developing my pendulum work, because naturally, like, when you work with a pendulum, you have to really make sure that you're not subconsciously influencing the answer by moving it. And when I changed from like train the alpha state like this, oh, gotta do the, too much grasping, to realizing it was just like, oh, just disassociate from your arm. I was like, oh, trust me, I know how to dissociate from body parts.
Yeah. Well, and I have this thing where like I don't even see my point of consciousness as being in my head. And
Oh,
like a lot of
wow.
people are like, really, that's weird. Like I don't have a lot of internal narration, you know? For me, I feel more like a sim. Like, I feel like I have this little, like, thing, like, my thoughts, my awareness is kind of more here, and I channel it through my mouth. And a lot of times I don't even know what I'm saying until it comes out of my mouth. Like, I have the general idea, the general concept. And so for me, I naturally know how to disassociate and feel and just kind of like expand out, and not everyone has that frame of reference or understands it. But there are ways that you can train yourself to reach those states. But yeah, it's all about like essentially, I think a lot of it is trying to point people in the direction of things. All these things are experiential. They're all different mysteries, is how we would frame it in witchcraft. And mysteries is like how I was talking about, like with dreams, this sort of like there's this je ne sais quoi quality to certain dreams that are prophetic or are a spirit visitation. And while I can't properly explain what that quality is, if you've had an experience with it, we can kind of talk about it and kind of understand what it is. I liken it a lot to psychedelic use. This idea of like a going on a mushroom trip or an acid trip. Before you have that experience, you hear people talking about it. You see it presented in the media, and you have this kind of idea of what that experience is going to be like. And then when you actually have the trip, you're like, "Oh, this is nothing. This is not Alice in Wonderland. This is not anything like I was experiencing." And every person on earth is going to have a different experience of tripping and what it was like for them and what their trip was. But once you've had that experience, you can talk about it to someone else who's had it, and you're both kind of on the same page because you've experienced the same mystery, the same experience. And I think that like even alpha is like that. These things are essentially their techniques trying to push you in the direction of figuring it out for yourself and what works for you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. This has been such a wonderful conversation, Matt. I'm going to bring on Tommy to ask her question of you as we wrap up. And we studied your book, as you know, we studied your book for 2 months in our advanced container. So I'm super excited to hear what Tommy has to ask today.
Yeah, well, I'll be honest, I kind of wanted to ask about the Circle Is podcast since I've started listening to that since we read The Psychic Witch in our container. But first, I'd like to know, are there any plans for a season 2 in the near future for Circle Is?
Yes, yes. The difficulty at the moment is Rachel and I are both working on projects on our own. And it's pretty much a one person show in the sense of like I do all the editing, I do all the like, and if you edit things, you understand it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work for every individual episode. And so like it's all about like just us getting to a point where we have the bandwidth, but we have every intention to keep it going. We just at the moment have a lot going on. But yes, we absolutely, it's not over. We should probably get rolling on that soon.
So, since your co host is famous for being a fictional witch, I'm
Mhm.
curious, say season 2, if you could have one actual fictional witch on as a guest, who would it be? Or what fictional witch would you want to learn from?
I don't know about learn from, but my answer would be Nancy from The Craft. That is my all-time favorite witchy icon. And, like Rachel and I have talked about having her on because Rachel obviously knows her, they're friends. So that is a possibility. But like The Craft was for me a spiritual experience as a child. That was being raised in a very extremely evangelical Pentecostal household, being able to see that and see magic portrayed as sort of like a more realistic, still horseshit, but a more realistic manner, and seeing like these girls become empowered and like use their magic to get what they want, was very like, oh, like I want to be a witch too. So for me, it would be Nancy. I am one of those people, like I love the character Nancy so much that I will defend her character to the death. I can go on a whole long tirade about how Sarah is the villain in the movie, and that anti she is the patriarchal anti-feminist wet blanket in the movie.
Yeah, no, there's no surprise for me there that it's yet another witch from the craft. I was actually just listening to your Omega Institute retreats talk and talking about that childhood experience of finding the craft.
Yeah.
Like, I just see it, and it wasn't just the witchcraft. I'm like, oh, those gals are having so much fun together. I want a coven of just gal pals. We don't have to make people bleed from their eyes or anything like that.
Yeah, well, and like, I was talking about being a child and forming covens. Like that was one of the big inspirations for it. And it was very like we had no idea what the hell we were doing. But it was very much like, no, you're water and you're fire. Like we had these, I don't know, it was silly, but
Did your childhood covens ever did anything ever come of that? Or did they ever inspire an experience that you're like, oh, we might have tapped into something there?
no, not my childhood experiences. My first real experience was the story that I share in Mastering Magic at the beginning, which I talk about in the mega episode of like my grandfather and using that Silver Raven Wolf spell, the anti-bully bullfrog spell, and having that work with such real results was my moment of like, oh, maybe this isn't like a playful pretend thing. Like maybe this is real. That was my moment. But before that, like I don't think anything really came of me and my little girlfriends playing witches and light as a feather, stiff as a board. Like I think it was more of like that sort of natural inclination, like I was saying, that kind of draw, that magnetism. Because even though my gateway was something as silly as the craft, it was still my first frame of reference for something like this that wasn't like, a green wicked witch.
I also come from like an evangelical background, like Midwest.
Mhm.
And, I love hearing the craft did exactly what my church and my parents always warned us about. Like, you watch the craft, you're going to become a witch and you're going to be in the devil's hands. And I haven't met the devil or anything, but
Which
I
is
did
so
watch the
funny because
craft.
then when you get in witchcraft, like a lot of things I would hear often is like, oh, you watch the craft and now you think you're a witch. So it's like the
Right.
opposite end of the spectrum, once you're in.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's why I'm so big on like, yeah, I did watch The Craft and it did make me think I was a witch. Like, that's why I'm totally like open of like, yes, my first experiences, my first love, like author love was Silver Raven Wolf, was Scott Cunningham, and I'm not ashamed of that at all. I'm not embarrassed, like everyone starts somewhere. And even with Silver Raven Wolf, like I remember, I think it was like 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, just as a fun experience, I was like, you know what? I think I'm going to open Teen Witch and try every spell in it and see what happens. And they all worked. And like, say what you want about like any of these 90s authors or whatever, but like Silver Ravenwolf, her shit works, So you got to give her credit for that at least.
It's better to start somewhere than not starting anywhere at all.
Amen. Yes.
Thank you, Matt. That's everything I wanted to possibly know about fictional witches and your relationship to them. So lovely.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love me. I mean, also just as a gay man, right? So like we love the witch archetype because like not just the witch, like I love a badass woman. I love a bitchy woman. I love a powerful woman. I am in love with powerful women, maybe not romantically or like sexually, but like, and witches embody that, right? Like even the Wicked Witch, even like these characters that are villains, it's like my favorite genre of movie is that good for her,
Yeah.
like Carrie or like, Midsummer or The Witch, where it's like, okay, The Witch, for example, I didn't realize after I watched it that people thought it had a bad ending. And I was like, really? Like I took something totally different from that movie. Like she was free, she was empowered, she was
She's
gonna
about to
get what
live
she wanted.
deliciously.
Yeah, she got to live deliciously and like to find out that like average everyday non-magical people had a totally different understanding of how that ended was really like kind of like, oh, we see things totally different. But yeah, I love me an empowered woman, and a witch is absolutely the most empowered woman, whether it's good or bad. She's going to get what she wants, and I think that's awesome. And I love that. So having a love of the occult and that kind of gay man aspect of like, standing women. I think that's why I love Nancy so much too, right? I mean, other than like the goth aesthetic, which I love as well.
Well, thank you again so much, Matt, for coming and joining us today. And so, once again, I want to encourage everyone listening out there. Psychic Witch is an amazing book. It's going to take you through the exercises that Matt lays out for you to develop and train your psychic ability. Because no matter what gifts you may start with, or maybe you feel like you're not starting with many at all, this is something that can be trained. And here at the Repatterning Project and the Repatterning Podcast, we believe in training our minds. Your mind body system is your domain, and programming it is your birthright. So thank you. And again, Matt, where can people find you, and what are the things that we should look forward to coming out from you in the near future?
Yeah, so I'm very big on like hush hush on future projects, but there are
Fair.
things in the work, there are things contracted. I treat it like magic because it is. So, until it's manifested, I don't talk about it. You can find me on auryn.net, AURYN.net. I'm all over pretty much every social media. The ones I'm the most active on is Instagram and Facebook, but I prefer Instagram honestly these days.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. Well, thank you again so much for joining us. Thank you to all who are listening out there. Thank you for joining us. And as a reminder, once again, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the repatterning podcast for just $5 a month. That gets you access to our Discord server. Come and join our community. And again, the next round of the Repatterning Project begins September 13th. So if you are looking to repattern your own mind body system, why not come and join and do it with us? And on that note, we'll see you again soon. Thank you for listening to the Repatterning Podcast. If you're curious about the Repatterning Project, the 8-week course in mental mastery and creative freedom that inspires these conversations, you can check out more details at therepatterningproject.com. We run a cohort twice a year, or you can download the self-study version of the course and get started today. We also offer a 4-week course on narrative magic and archetype titled Myths and Magic, Changing Your Life Through Story, also twice a year. If you'd like to join our community, the Repatterning Parlor, on Discord, you can sign up for $5 a month at patreon.com/the Repatterning Podcast. Thanks to everyone who makes the Repatterning Podcast possible. Firstly, our award-winning producer, Tommy Trembath of the Keymaster Collective network of podcasts. She also produces Transcending Comics, Vision in the Void, and Giant-Sized Violence. Thanks also to animation studio Mortis and Madriax, who created the video for our introduction, as well as to Andrew Means, who composed and produced our theme music. And also thanks to Al Alvarez, who took the photos of yours truly that you see on the cover of each episode if you're watching the video version. And finally, thanks to you, our listeners, who give meaning to this work. Our greatest wish is that whatever you've heard today inspires you to live freely and begin creating your reality from the inside out. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon.